Everything you rely on can be shut down. Not by war, but by control. One decision can stop factories. Another can freeze global supply chains overnight. And those decisions are already happening. Right now. And you wouldn't even notice it. This isn't tension. It's a war between the US and China. Fought inside the systems your life depends on. It doesn't start with soldiers crossing a border. It starts with decisions buried deep inside systems you never see. Decisions made inside ministries and corporate strategy rooms. Decisions that rarely appear in headlines but quietly change global behavior. Decisions that move faster than public awareness can ever catch up. Factories are already shutting down without explanation. Orders paused, workers sent home, contracts suddenly delayed without clear reason. Entire production lines idled while executives wait for signals that never arrive. Machines remain silent while demand continues to build elsewhere. A shipment delayed at a port for reasons that never become public. Customs checks increase, approvals slow, and timelines quietly collapse. Containers sit for days, sometimes weeks, without any official justification. Schedules break, and downstream systems begin to absorb the pressure. But it isn't. Because it doesn't disappear, it accumulates and compounds over time. What looks temporary begins to repeat, then normalize, then escalate. Patterns form before anyone publicly acknowledges them. Because this kind of conflict doesn't need explosions to spread. It moves through pressure, dependency, and control over what cannot be replaced. And once a system becomes dependent, it becomes vulnerable to interruption. Vulnerability that can be triggered without warning or accountability. A system that cannot adapt quickly becomes a system that can be controlled. And once it begins, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads across systems that were built for efficiency, not resistance. Systems optimized for cost suddenly become exposed to disruption. Weakness emerges not from failure, but from optimization itself. It expands. Slowly at first. Then all at once. And the reality is, it has already been expanding for years. Long before it was recognized as conflict. Long before it felt like something that could reach you. Long before it had a name that could be understood. What looked like cooperation was never stable. It was leverage building quietly underneath the surface. Every transaction reinforcing interdependence without reducing risk. Every contract deepening reliance on distant systems. Every efficiency gain hiding a future vulnerability. For decades, companies in the United States moved production overseas. Costs dropped, margins expanded, and supply chains stretched across continents. Efficiency became the dominant logic guiding every strategic decision. Resilience was considered unnecessary as long as systems kept working. Globalization rewarded speed, scale, and cost reduction above resilience. Short-term gains outweighed long-term stability in nearly every sector. Risk was distributed so widely that it became invisible. China became the center of that system. Not by accident, but through scale, speed, and state-backed expansion. Policies designed to absorb and dominate global manufacturing demand. A long-term strategy aligned with short-term global incentives. Factories multiplied. Infrastructure accelerated. Ports expanded to handle volumes never seen before. Rail networks connected industrial zones directly to export channels. Entire logistical systems synchronized to support continuous output. Entire industries relocated. Electronics, textiles, machinery, and critical industrial inputs. Production ecosystems formed that could not easily be replicated elsewhere. Clusters of expertise concentrated into specific geographic regions. And with each shift, something subtle changed. Control. Because production wasn't just about making goods anymore. It became about who could interrupt them. And interruption at the wrong moment could ripple globally. Even a small delay could trigger cascading shortages. Even a minor disruption could reveal hidden dependencies. At first, nobody felt the risk. Everything was working too well. Supply chains were invisible, and reliability felt guaranteed. Products arrived on time, and systems appeared stable. Confidence replaced caution across entire industries. But dependence doesn't feel dangerous until it's tested. And then it was. The first cracks didn't look like war. They looked like tariffs. Trade restrictions introduced under economic justification. Policies framed as protection, but functioning as strategic pressure. Official language masked the underlying shift in intent. The framing softened what was actually happening underneath. Prices shifted, supply chains adjusted, and companies scrambled to adapt. Margins tightened, sourcing shifted, and uncertainty increased. Executives began planning for scenarios they had never considered before. Risk moved from theoretical to operational reality. But that was only the beginning. Because tariffs don't break systems. They reveal where systems are fragile. They expose which links cannot be easily replaced. They map out vulnerabilities in real time. They show exactly where pressure will be most effective. And once those weak points were exposed, they became targets. The conflict moved deeper. From trade into technology. Because in a modern system, control isn't about raw materials alone. It's about the components that everything else depends on. Invisible layers that define capability and limitation. Layers that most people never think about until they fail. Layers that quietly determine who can advance and who cannot. And nothing is more critical than semiconductors. The chips inside your phone. Your laptop. Your car. Everything. Even infrastructure systems rely on them to function properly. From power grids to financial networks to communication systems. Without them, modern systems simply stop. And here, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. Taiwan produces a massive share of the world's most advanced chips. Estimates range from around 60 to over 90%. A concentration unmatched in any other critical industry. A single point of failure embedded in the global system. A dependency that cannot be easily diversified. Not basic components. The most advanced ones. The ones that power AI systems, military hardware, and critical infrastructure. They determine processing power, efficiency, and technological progress. They define who can lead and who must follow. They influence both economic and military outcomes simultaneously. And that concentration creates a choke point. One location. One system. That cannot fail. Because failure would disrupt multiple global sectors simultaneously. Industries built on precision timing would suddenly collapse. Synchronization across supply chains would break instantly. But it also cannot be replaced quickly. Building equivalent capacity requires years of investment and expertise. Talent, infrastructure, and knowledge cannot be replicated overnight. Even funding cannot accelerate what depends on accumulated experience. Which means control over that system becomes leverage. And that's where the pressure intensified. China didn't attack Taiwan directly. It didn't need to. Instead, it targeted access. Export controls were introduced. Restrictions on advanced chip technology tightened. Policies specifically designed to slow technological advancement elsewhere. Not to stop progress completely, but to control its pace. To shape the trajectory rather than block it entirely. Not just on finished products. On the machines required to produce them. Because there is another layer beneath semiconductors. The tools. Extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. Manufactured by a single company. ASML. Without them, cutting-edge chips cannot be produced. No substitute currently matches their precision and capability. Entire production processes depend on their availability. They represent a bottleneck that cannot be bypassed. And access to those machines is tightly controlled. Governments influence who can and cannot receive them. Licensing decisions become geopolitical decisions. Supply becomes a tool of strategy, not just commerce. Which means, whoever controls access to the tools controls the future of the system. And suddenly, the conflict wasn't about trade anymore. It was about capability. China responded. Not with direct confrontation. But with acceleration. Massive investment into domestic chip production. State-directed funding at an unprecedented industrial scale. Programs designed to reduce dependency over time. Strategic patience combined with long-term planning. Billions redirected into building independent capacity. Entire supply chains reconstructed to reduce reliance on external inputs. New facilities built at a pace rarely seen in peacetime economies. Efforts focus not just on catching up, but on closing the gap. But scaling this kind of system takes time. Years. And delays accumulate across sectors relying on advanced components. Each delay widening the gap between capability and ambition. Each setback reinforcing the importance of control. And during that time, the pressure remains. Because the restrictions didn't stop at hardware. They moved into software. Into AI models. Into advanced computing ecosystems. Into cloud infrastructure and data access. Into the very foundation of future innovation. Into talent. Limits on collaboration. Limits on knowledge transfer. Even limits on who could work where. Restrictions targeting individuals and expertise, not just companies. Engineers forced to choose between systems and allegiances. Knowledge itself becoming part of the battlefield. And each restriction added another layer of friction. Not enough to break the system instantly, but enough to slow it. And slowing a system that depends on speed is its own form of damage. Lost time directly translates into lost competitive advantage. In a race defined by innovation, delay is loss. But it didn't stop there. Because technology isn't the only battlefield. The conflict expanded into something harder to detect. Cyber operations. Intrusions into infrastructure. Attempts to map vulnerabilities. Probing energy grids, financial systems, and communication networks. Testing responses without triggering open confrontation. Learning where pressure can be applied later. Not necessarily to destroy, but to understand. Because knowing how a system fails is power. It allows disruption at the exact point of maximum impact. Precision replaces brute force as the dominant strategy. And that creates a different kind of tension. Invisible. Constant. Always unresolved. At the same time, physical pressure increased. Not through invasion, but through presence. In the South China Sea, where roughly a third of global trade flows. A critical corridor connecting major economic regions. A route that cannot easily be bypassed. A system that depends on uninterrupted movement. Shipping lanes that connect manufacturing centers to the rest of the world. And control over those lanes isn't theoretical. It's enforced through military positioning. Artificial islands. Surveillance systems. Expanded radar and missile coverage across key zones. Capabilities designed to influence without direct confrontation. Power expressed through positioning rather than action. And each move changes the balance slightly. Ships continue to pass through. Trade continues to flow. But the conditions are shifting. Quietly. And that uncertainty creates risk. Because if those routes are disrupted, the impact isn't regional. It's global. Supply chains don't reroute instantly. Alternate routes increase cost and delivery time significantly. Insurance premiums rise, and confidence drops. Financial markets react before physical systems adjust. They stall. Prices rise. Availability drops. And the effects spread outward. Into energy markets. Into food systems. Into everyday life. Which means this conflict is already affecting you. Even if you never see it directly. It appears as inflation, shortages, and instability without clear origin. Small changes that feel disconnected but are deeply linked. And then comes the shift. Because at some point, the balance becomes clearer. The United States holds key technological choke points. Critical systems that define computing, defense, and advanced innovation. Control over design, software, and specialized manufacturing inputs. China holds something equally powerful. Scale. Industrial capacity at a level no other country can match. Production volumes that sustain entire global industries. Factories capable of producing at speed and volume. Infrastructure designed for rapid expansion. Supply chains integrated within a single national system. And deep integration into global supply chains. Which creates a dangerous symmetry. Because both sides depend on the system, while also trying to control it. And that means escalation has limits. Push too far. And both sides absorb the damage. Which is why the conflict doesn't explode. It tightens. Gradually. Each move calculated. Each response measured. But the pressure keeps building. And then everything starts pointing toward one place. Taiwan. Not just as a location, but as a trigger. Because if control over advanced chip production shifts, everything else shifts with it. Military balance, technological dominance, economic stability, all connected. And that creates a scenario where the cost of inaction rises, while the cost of action becomes catastrophic. Which is where the tension peaks. Because this is the point where invisible conflict risks becoming visible. Military exercises increase. Naval presence expands. Airspace violations become more frequent. Flights designed to test detection and response capabilities. Signals sent without crossing the line into war. Not enough to start a war, but enough to signal readiness. And every signal is interpreted. Every movement analyzed. Because miscalculation here doesn't stay local. It cascades. If Taiwan becomes unstable, production stops. Even temporarily. And the shock would be immediate. Industries dependent on advanced chips would stall. Automotive. Technology. Defense. Systems designed for efficiency would suddenly face interruption. And the scale of that disruption is difficult to fully measure. Because it's not just about what stops working. It's about what cannot restart quickly. And that delay becomes damage. Which is why neither side can afford escalation. But neither side can step back completely either. Because stepping back means losing leverage. And losing leverage means losing control. So the system holds. For now. Balanced on pressure. Maintained through restraint. But constantly shifting underneath. And that creates a different kind of outcome. This war doesn't end with a victory. There is no clear moment where one side wins. No decisive battle. Instead, it evolves. Managed. Adjusted. Contained where possible. Escalated where necessary. Because the goal isn't to destroy the opponent. It's to outposition them. To control more of the system over time. And that process doesn't stop. It accelerates. New technologies. New dependencies. New vulnerabilities. Each one becoming part of the same conflict. And the deeper it goes, the harder it becomes to separate from it. Because by the time you feel the impact directly, it's already too late to avoid it.